So, Ryan Willard here again, and this vlog is all about why I love sales. Now, selling, I say this a lot on the Business of Architecture podcast, it's often one of the things that people have a lot of hesitation around, have a lot of resistance to, hate doing, don't like it, and culturally and societally, we've come to associate the salesperson or the archetypal image of the salesperson as some kind of dodgy Del Boy kind of character doing something shifty, trying to pull the wool over your eyes, someone who is perpetually trying to convince you or maneuver and manipulate you into doing something you don't necessarily want to do, or putting you under undue amounts of pressure to make a purchase for something that's really not that useful to your life. That is what we think of when we think of sales. That's the kind of automatic archetypal image that our minds retrieve when we think of selling. And I think that persona of salesperson is one of the reasons why we often have a resistance to it, or we do not want to be associated with that, particularly in the professions. In architecture, for example, I know that is not at all how architects want to be perceived. We want to be perceived as learned educators and stewards of the built environment who can beautifully, and intellectually who are intellectually refined and creative and are able to, they're artists, or they are great communicators, or there is a nobility to it, right? Not the salesperson. Now, I fell in love with sales when I was doing my Part 1 architecture. And I didn't do it necessarily consciously. And sales for me, I can't remember who said this quote, it might be a Sandler quote from somewhere, but sales is like a mix of psychology and theater. And it's deep human communication. And whenever any kind of interaction you have with another human being is a form of sales. You're either selling something, you're either selling beliefs, ideas. You could be trying to get your partner or your wife to go and see the movie that you want to go and see, or perhaps you're going to ask a lady or a man or whoever out on a date. There's a form of sales going on there. There's a form of communication, which is having somebody be influenced by yourself. To have them alter their behavior or make a decision about something. So in that level, every kind of human interaction has a form of selling. If you ever think of what the oldest profession in the world is, it's sales, right? It is sales. I've heard entrepreneurs before say quite provocative statements like Gandhi or Mother Teresa were great salespeople. And the reality of it is they are. They have been able to authentically communicate a set of spiritual and political values to influence millions of people's behavior. And that at the core of it is the same deep human communication that is selling. And selling for me anyway, like I was about to say why I kind of fell in love with the art of selling or got interested in it, was when I was about 21 years old, and I'd finished my architecture degree. I'd done a year out here in London, and then I went to Australia for another year out, and I kind of went with no plan, and my parents were living out there at the time, and I kind of had this dream of, I don't really know what the dream was, but it involved beaches and et cetera, right? Well, I got there, and I didn't really have a portfolio with me, because for some reason I didn't bring it, and I couldn't get any kind of job in an architecture firm, and I was kind of wanted to do something different from architecture, and then realized that it wasn't that easy, and so I had this degree, and I was trying to go to architecture firms, and they were all like, mate, you don't have any experience in Australia, and we can only take you on for a few months. So I'm afraid we can't employ you. And you don't know anything about Australian building code. So I was like, pain. And I was quickly running out of money and all that kind of stuff. And I had to get a job. And there was this job that was ideal for backpackers at the time, which was being a charity advocate for the Cancer Council. Now, a charity advocate is the polite term. The derogatory term is a chugger. And it's one of those gentlemen that will stand on the side of the streets and they will wave you down and get you to register into making monthly donations to a particular charity. Now, this job was brutal. It was not for the faint-hearted. It probably had the highest turnover of any kind of job I've ever seen anything anywhere. People literally lasted a couple of days, or not even a couple of hours rather, and were like, no, I'm out, I'm leaving this. So I ended up applying for this job. We had a couple of days training in the centre where you learn a pitch and you kind of do that and you learn to stand in front of people and then you learn how to wave people down and say hello and greet people. And it was really fascinating. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. And it was a certain kind of personality that was drawn to that job as well. Lots of kind of extroverted people and personality type. And that for me was amazing. So I hadn't really, in architecture education, I think perhaps we're more of an introverted breed. Not always, but it's certainly more of a solitary type of discipline. So being around all these people that were, very, very extroverted and, flamboyant in many ways was a lot of fun. And when we got out there onto the streets, you were put out onto the pavement, and your job was to stand there, was to grab somebody's attention for long enough to have a conversation with them, and then have them enrolled and register into signing up for a minimum of £10 a month or whatever it was to donate to the charity. And the first day was, you're just there, I'm waving, and I used to put on this kind of faux English accent where I'd be like, all right, darling, how you doing? Which seemed to work, I'm afraid, to Australians. And it was just really, it was a load of fun. It was a lot of fun, but very difficult to kind of get there in the conversation. And, you'd either just start pitching and just blah, 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 just start pitching or selling to somebody quite blatantly. And then you could see that they weren't interested and they were waiting to get out of the conversation and they would leave. But at the end of the day, the first day I had, I managed to register somebody, and I was so excited. I was like, oh my goodness, I was hooked. I was hooked at that point. And for the next 6 months, or I think it was even longer than that, it might have been about 9 months, but I ended up doing this sales job on the streets and travelling around all of New South Wales and meeting people. And what I'd learned in that experience was I got really, really fascinated in people, and I got really, really interested in listening to people. My mum at the time was a counsellor, and I remember going back and I'd ask her certain questions about, because people often thought they didn't realise I was paid necessarily. A lot of people in Australia had dealt with cancer and were dealing with cancer, and you'd often be in this kind of street therapy situation where people were pouring out their very intimate stories, and my job was to listen and also to create a safe space for people to feel comfortable where they could do that. And I remember my mum giving me a set of questions, like a reflexive listening questions. And this was the beginning of understanding more about selling and the deeper aspects of what selling actually is. And it's listening. It's actually deeply listening to people and giving them that space for them to hear and to voice their deepest concerns and their pains. And it was very moving. There were some very, very moving stories, which I'll have to tell you about at another point. But that was my introduction into selling and why I fell in love with sales.